Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 7, 2003, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Paul, is now recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman's request is so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, at the close of the Constitutional Convention in 1787, Benjamin Franklin told an inquisitive citizen that the delegates to the Constitutional Convention gave the people a republic if you can keep it. We should now apologize to Mr. Franklin. It is obvious that the republic is gone and we are wallowing in a pure democracy against which the founders had strongly warned. Madison, the father of the Constitution, could not have been more explicit in his fear and concern for democracies. Quote, "Democracies have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contentions, have ever been found incompatible with personal security or the rights of property, and have in general been as short in their lives as they have been violent in their deaths." Close quote. If Madison's assessment was correct, it behooves those of us in Congress to take note and decide indeed whether the republic has vanished, when it occurred, and exactly what to expect in the ways of turbulence, contention, and violence. And above all else, what can we and what will we do about it? The turbulence seems self-evident. Domestic welfare programs are not sustainable and do not accomplish their stated goals. State and federal spending and deficits are out of control. Terrorism and uncontrollable fear undermines our sense of well-being. Hysterical reactions to dangers not yet seen prompt the people at the prodding of the politicians to readily sacrifice their liberties in vain hope that someone else will take care of them and guarantee their security. With these obvious signs of a failed system all around us, there seems to be more determination than ever to antagonize the people of the world by pursuing a world empire. Nation building, foreign intervention, preemptive war, and global government drive our foreign policy. There seems to be complete aversion to defending the Republic and the Constitution that established it. The founders clearly understood the dangers of a democracy. Edmund Randolph of Virginia described the effort to deal with the issue at the Constitutional Convention. Quote, "The general object was to produce a cure for the evils under which the United States labored, that in tracing these evils to their origins, every man had found it in the turbulence and follies of democracy." Close quote. These strongly held views regarding the evils of democracies and the benefit of a constitutional republic were shared by all the founders. For them, a democracy meant centralized power, controlled by a majority opinion, which was up for grabs and therefore completely arbitrary. In contrast, a republic was decentralized and representative in nature, with the government's purpose strictly limited by the Constitution to the protection of liberty and private property ownership. They believed the majority should never be able to undermine this principle and that the government must be tightly held in check by constitutional restraints. The difference between a democracy and a republic was simple. Would we live under the age-old concept of the rule of man or the enlightened rule of law? A constitution in and by itself does not guarantee liberty in a republican form of government. Even a perfect constitution with this goal in mind is no better than the moral standards and desires of the people. Although the United States Constitution was by far the best ever written for the protection of liberty, with safeguards against the dangers of a democracy, it too was flawed from the beginning. Instead of guaranteeing liberty equally for all people, the authors themselves yielded to the Democratic majority's demands that they compromise on the issue of slavery. This mistake, plus others along the way, culminated in a civil war that surely could have been prevented with clearer understanding and a more principled approach to the establishment of a constitutional republic. Subsequently, the same urge to accommodate majority opinion while ignoring the principles of individual liberty led to some other serious errors. Even amending the Constitution in a proper fashion to impose alcohol prohibition turned out to be a disaster. Fortunately, this was rectified after a short time with its repeal. But today, the American people accept drug prohibition, a policy equally damaging to liberty as was alcohol prohibition. A majority vote in Congress has been enough to impose this very expensive and failed program on the American people, even without bothering to amend the Constitution. It has been met with only minimal, but fortunately, growing dissent. For the first 150 years of our history, when we were much closer to being a true republic, there were no federal laws dealing with the serious medical problem of addiction. The ideas of democracy, not the principles of liberty, were responsible for the passage of the 16th Amendment. It imposed the income tax on the American people and helped usher in the modern age of the welfare warfare state. Unfortunately, the 16th Amendment has not been repealed, as was the 18th. As long as the 16th Amendment is in place, the odds are slim that we can restore a constitutional republic dedicated to liberty. The personal income tax is more than symbolic of a democracy. It is a predictable consequence. The transition from republic to democracy was gradual and insidious. Its seeds were sown early in our history. In many ways, the Civil War and its aftermath laid the foundation for the acute erosion that took place over the entire 20th century. Chronic concern about war and economic downturns, events caused by an intrusive government's failure to follow the binding restraints of the Constitution, allowed majority demands to supersede the rights of the minority. By the end of the 20th century, majority opinion had become the determining factor in all that government does. The rule of law was cast aside, leaving the Constitution a shell of what it once was. A constitution with rules that guaranteed a republic with limited and regional government and protection of personal liberty. The marketplace, driven by voluntary cooperation, private property ownership, and sound money, was severely undermined with the acceptance of the principles of true democracy. Unfortunately, too many people confuse the democratic elections of leaders in a republic for democracy by accepting the rule of majority opinion in all affairs. For majorities to pick leaders is one thing. It is something quite different for majorities to decide what rights are, to redistribute property, to tell people how to manage their personal lives, and to promote undeclared, unconstitutional wars. The majority is assumed to be in charge today and can do whatever it pleases. If the majority has not yet sanctioned some desired egregious action demanded by special interests, the propaganda machine goes into operation and the pollsters relay the results back to the politicians who are seeking legitimacy in their endeavors. The rule of law and the Constitution have become irrelevant, and we live by constant polls. This trend toward authoritarian democracy was tolerated because, unlike a military dictatorship, it was done in the name of benevolence, fairness, and equity. The pretense of love and compassion by those who desire to remold society and undermine the Constitution convinced the recipients and even the victims of its necessity. Since it was never a precipitous departure from the Republic, the gradual erosion of liberty went unnoticed. But it is encouraging that more and more citizens are realizing just how much has been lost by complacency. The resolution to the problems we face as a result of this profound transition to pure democracy will be neither quick nor painless. This transition has occurred even though the word democracy does not appear in the Constitution or in the Declaration of Independence, and the founders explicitly denounced it. Over the last 100 years, the goal of securing individual liberties within the framework of a constitutional republic has been replaced with incessant talk of democracy and fairness. Rallying support for our ill-advised participation in World War I, Wilson spoke glowingly of making the world safe for democracy and never mentioned national security. This theme has to this day persisted in all our foreign affairs. Neoconservatives now brag of their current victories in promoting what they call hard Wilsonianism. A true defense of self-determination for all people, the necessary ingredient of a free society, is ignored. Self-determination implies separation of smaller governments from the larger entities that we witness in the breakup of the Soviet Union. This notion contradicts the goal of pure democracy and a world government. A single world government is the ultimate goal of all social egalitarians who are unconcerned with liberty. Today, the concepts of rights and property ownership are completely arbitrary. Congress, the courts, presidents, and bureaucrats arbitrarily legislate on a daily basis, seeking only the endorsement of the majority. Although the Republic was designed to protect the minority against the dictates of the majority, today we find the reverse. The Republic is no longer recognizable. Supporters of democracy are always quick to point out one of the perceived benefits of this system is the redistribution of wealth by government to the poor. Although this may be true in a limited fashion, the champions of this system never concern themselves with the victims from whom the wealth is stolen. The so-called benefits are short-lived because democracy consumes wealth with little concern for those who produce it. Eventually, the programs cannot be funded, and the dependency that has developed precipitates angry outcries for even more fairness. Since reversing the tide against liberty is so difficult, this unworkable system inevitably leads to various forms of tyranny. As our republic crumbles, voices of protest grow louder. The central government becomes more authoritarian with each crisis. As the quality of education plummets, the role of the federal government is expanded. As the quality of medical care collapses, the role of the federal government in medicine is greatly increased. Foreign policy failures precipitate cries for more intervention abroad and an even greater empire. Cries for security grow louder, and concern for liberty languishes. Attacks on our homeland prompt massive increase in the bureaucracy to protect us from all danger seen and imagined. The prime goal and concern of the founders, the protection of liberty, is ignored. Those expressing any serious concern for personal liberty are condemned for their self-centeredness and their lack of patriotism. Even if we could defeat the Al-Qaeda, which is surely a worthwhile goal, it would do little to preserve our liberties while ignoring the real purpose of our government. Another enemy would surely replace it, just as the various groups of so-called barbarians never left the Roman Empire alone once its internal republican structure collapsed. Once it becomes acceptable to change the rules by majority vote, there are no longer any limits on the power of the government. When the Constitution can be subverted by mere legislative votes, executive orders, or judicial decrees, constitutional restraints on the government are eliminated. This process was rare in the early years of our history, but now it's routine. Democracy is promoted in the name of fairness in an effort to help some special interest group gain a benefit that it claims it needs or is entitled to. If only one small group were involved, nothing would come of the demands. But coalitions develop, and the various groups band together to form a majority, to vote themselves all those things that they expect others to provide for them. Although the motivating factor is frequently the desire for the poor to better themselves through the willingness of others to sacrifice for what they see as a good cause, the process is doomed to failure. Governments are inefficient, and the desired goals are rarely achieved. Administrators, who benefit, perpetuate the programs. Wealthy elites learn to benefit from the system in a superior fashion over the poor, because they know how to skim the cream off the top of all the programs designed for the disadvantaged. They join the various groups in producing the majority vote needed to fund their own special interests. Public financing of housing, for instance, benefit builders, bureaucrats, insurance companies, and financial institutions, while the poor end up in drug-infested, crime-ridden housing projects. For the same reason, not only do business leaders not object to the system, but they also become strong supporters of welfare programs and foreign aid. Big business strongly supports programs like the Export-Import Bank, the IMF, the World Bank, farm subsidies, and military adventurism. Tax code revisions and government contracts mean big profits for those who are well-connected. Concern for individual liberty is pushed to the bottom of the priority list for both the poor and the rich welfare recipients.